We are entering a new era of confrontation with the most powerful communist regime in human history, the Chinese Communist Party. In 2025, President Donald Trump did something no US leader had ever done. He declared November 2nd to 8th as Anti-Communism Week, a national memorial for the 100 million lives destroyed by communist regimes. But this proclamation is not just about history. It's a message to the entire free world. We are entering a new era of confrontation with the most powerful communist regime in human history, the Chinese Communist Party. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union terrorized half of Europe without having China's population, wealth, or global reach. Yet today's CCP is stronger, richer, and far more sophisticated. It has fused authoritarian control with global capitalism, weaponized supply chains and technology, infiltrated international institutions, and exported surveillance tools to dictators worldwide. From Tibet and East Turkestan to Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, and the South China Sea, Beijing is applying the same imperial playbook over and over again. Trump's Anti-Communism Week marks a turning point, the moment democratic nations finally recognize that the CCP's ambitions will not stop at Taiwan, and will not stop until it rewrites the global order itself. Today's Chinese Communist Party is far stronger and far more cunning than the Soviet Union ever was. Since the 1970s, when Beijing replaced the Republic of China at the United Nations, the CCP has used globalization as its Trojan horse, quietly pushing its influence into every corner of the world. And unlike Moscow, which collapsed under the weight of its own rigid central planning, Beijing learned from the Soviet failure and turned those lessons into fuel for its rise. By opening parts of its economy, China tapped directly into the financial capital and cutting-edge technology of democratic nations. At the same time, it exploited every advantage of a communist system: massive state subsidies, total control over labor, and the ability to crush dissent with the full force of the government. As a result, we see global manufacturing and high-tech supply chains were pulled into China. That gave the CCP unprecedented leverage, the ability to control industries, steal and absorb advanced technologies, and undercut foreign competitors until they collapsed. Once China dominates an industry, it can weaponize it. This is how the CCP achieves military-civil fusion, turning economic power into strategic and military advantage. To justify this expansion, Beijing sells a seductive narrative to the world that wealth can coexist with authoritarianism, even outperform democracy. But because the CCP has no democratic legitimacy, it must constantly expand until no rival remains. So we're talking not only about territorial ambitions, but also ideological. Its ultimate goal is to reshape how people think, both inside China and far beyond its borders. In simple terms, CCP is a global project of political and ideological brainwashing. China understands one thing with absolute clarity: if it cannot control what people think, it will eventually collapse, just as the Soviet Union did. That's why Beijing builds its power from the inside out. First, it manufactures academic theories that justify the CCP's political legitimacy. Then it turns those theories into legal frameworks. Once the laws exist, they become the basis for propaganda. And once propaganda shapes public opinion, the CCP uses the language of justice and law enforcement to silence anyone who questions the regime. This creates a climate of fear at home and abroad. Dissidents who flee overseas still face harassment, intimidation, and transnational repression. And with all opposition crushed, the CCP can channel foreign investment and the wealth extracted from its own people into one goal. You probably all know what this goal is. It's building a military powerful enough to reshape the world. This method of expansion has never changed. Unlike the Soviet idea of creating a single Soviet man, the CCP uses a far more deceptive hybrid strategy. It blends the old imperial model of territorial domination, forced assimilation, population transfers, cultural erasure, with Marxist-Leninist state-building ideology. Then it wraps everything in a modern nationalist package called the Chinese nation to confuse both domestic and foreign audiences. In Tibet, East Turkestan, and southern Mongolia, Beijing imposes intense ideological indoctrination and cultural control. It dismantles local identities, rewrites history, and replaces diverse cultures with a single CCP-approved national identity. The goal is simple and absolute. It's to cement these lands and peoples as indivisible parts of the Communist Chinese state, permanently, irreversibly, and by force if necessary. In Tibet, Beijing is dismantling cultural identity at its foundations. The education system has been turned into an instrument of assimilation. Most Tibetan children are now sent to state-run boarding schools, separated from their families and raised in an environment where Tibetan language, traditions, and beliefs are treated as obstacles to be removed. The goal here is to reshape an entire generation so thoroughly that they grow up identifying with the party, not with their own heritage. In Xinjiang or East Turkestan, the scale of social control is unprecedented. Under the banner of counter-terrorism, the region has been transformed into a high-tech laboratory of surveillance. Over 1 million Uyghurs and other minorities have been detained in so-called re-education centers, where accounts of torture, political indoctrination, and cultural destruction have become impossible to ignore. For the CCP, identity itself is treated as a threat. Southern Mongolia has faced similar pressure. Since 2020, Mandarin has been imposed as the primary language in key school subjects, triggering widespread protests among students, parents, and teachers. Beijing responded with arrests, the closure of Mongolian language platforms, and the removal of books and historical materials from classrooms. Everything that sustains a distinct culture is gradually pushed out, replaced by a Han-centric narrative approved by the state. Across all three regions, the pattern is identical: weaken local identities, silence resistance, and fold entire peoples into a single political and cultural mold defined by the CCP. Hong Kong's story follows the same pattern, applied to a society whose political values fundamentally differ from Beijing's. When Deng Xiaoping met Margaret Thatcher in 1982, he made the power imbalance clear. He warned that China could retake Hong Kong this afternoon if it chose to. With Hong Kong dependent on the mainland for basic resources and Britain unable to counter a PLA invasion, the message carried real weight. The Sino-British Joint Declaration of 1984 was the compromise. Hong Kong would be handed over in 1997, and Beijing promised 50 years of autonomy, independent courts, open elections, and protections for free speech and assembly. These weren't just casual assurances, they were all written into an international treaty registered at the United Nations. Once sovereignty transferred, those commitments steadily eroded. By 2020, Beijing bypassed Hong Kong's legislature to impose the national security law, and later pushed Article 23 legislation. Opposition groups dissolved, journalists were arrested, and civil society was hollowed out. Within a few years, Hong Kong's pluralistic political culture was replaced by a tightly controlled system aligned with the party's priorities. Beijing understands that ideology today can't be controlled by the way it was during the Cold War. Closing borders and policing physical movement is no longer enough. Instead, the CCP has shifted to shaping global public opinion directly. Platforms like TikTok and Xiaohongshu are used to push curated narratives about China, stories that soften its image, normalize authoritarian governance, and cultivate pro-Beijing sentiment among younger audiences around the world. At the same time, China exports digital authoritarianism. It helps dictatorships build nationwide surveillance systems, integrating AI, facial recognition, and predictive policing algorithms. These tools give governments the ability to identify potential dissent before it occurs and suppress it preemptively. For many regimes, this becomes a new model for political survival, one that is increasingly tied to Beijing. The CCP also knows the political influence that diaspora communities can have in democratic countries, so it extends its control beyond its borders. Dissidents abroad face pressure from a range of tactics: covert police outposts, intimidation, and diplomatic or economic leverage aimed at forcing host countries to hand people over. Beijing regularly uses Interpol red notices and bilateral agreements to pursue activists overseas. Countries such as Thailand, Egypt, Malaysia, Saudi Arabia, and Tajikistan have all at times cooperated in sending Uyghurs back to China, despite the clear risk of persecution. Turkey, once seen as a refuge, has become increasingly hostile. Uyghurs are now labeled with vague security codes like G87, which led to cancelled residency, denied visas, detention and deportation centers, and looming expulsion. Even though Turkey is bound by the international treaties that forbid returning people to places where they face torture, the law is often ignored in practice. Courts and immigration authorities frequently refuse to acknowledge the scale of abuses in Xinjiang or East Turkestan. And the pressure isn't limited to Uyghurs. Hong Kong activists in the UK have reported a more difficult environment as well, longer delays, more uncertainty, and stricter scrutiny in asylum and residency procedures. And it all became very obvious after the change in government. I interviewed some of the Hong Kong refugees this September, and their experiences reflect a broader trend. Beijing's influence doesn't stop at its borders, it follows people wherever they go. Once we understand the CCP's internal playbook, its behavior towards neighboring sovereign states becomes easier to read. For nearly 70 years, Beijing has relied on the same pattern: blur borders from the inside out, deny the legitimacy of countries it wants to absorb, isolate their allies, and then slowly chip away at territory and resources through gray zone tactics. This is how the CCP expands influence without formally declaring a war. It uses legal arguments, propaganda, and incremental pressure to erode the sovereignty of others, one small step at a time. Taiwan has been the prime target of its strategy. For decades, Beijing has promoted a distorted interpretation of the UN Resolution 2758, claiming it proves Taiwan as an inseparable part of China. Even though the resolution says nothing about Taiwan's sovereignty, it doesn't mention the word Taiwan even a single time. This narrative is repeated worldwide, while the CCP works to squeeze Taiwan out of every international organization it can. As China's economic power grew, the pressure intensified. On September 1st, 2025, Beijing held its first ever World War II victory parade, openly attempting to replace the Republic of China, the actual Allied victor in Asia, with the PRC in the historical narrative. Then, on October 24th, China's National People's Congress created a new Taiwan Restoration Date for October 25th, deliberately blurring the line between the ROC and the PRC in the eyes of foreigners. Just 4 days later, Beijing went even further. It invoked Chinese domestic law to open an investigation into Taiwanese legislator Shen Boyang, Puma Shen, issuing a so-called global arrest warrant to intimidate him and restrict his international travel. Legislator Shan responded by attending an International Freedom Summit in The Hague on November 22nd, demonstrating that China's attempts at long-arm jurisdiction cannot dictate where Taiwanese citizens can or cannot go. This episode shows how Beijing blends legal warfare, political intimidation, and historical revisionism to undermine Taiwan's sovereignty from multiple angles, internationally, diplomatically, and even symbolically. Japan has become one of the clearest voices warning about the regional consequences of a Chinese attack on Taiwan. This November, just weeks after taking office, Prime Minister Takaichi Sanae told the Japanese Diet that any Chinese blockade or military strike on Taiwan could trigger an existential crisis under Japan's 2015 security legislation. If such a crisis were declared, Japan could legally exercise its collective self-defense, potentially joining the United States and responding to Chinese aggression. Beijing reacted immediately. Chinese embassies and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs accused Takaichi of crossing red lines and reviving Japanese militarism. On November 22nd, the China's UN ambassador sent a formal letter to Secretary General Antonio Guterres, warning that Japanese involvement in the Taiwan Strait would be treated as an act of aggression and that China would respond under its claimed right of self-defense. Alongside the diplomatic threats, Beijing began rolling out economic retaliation, suspending certain seafood imports, restricting Chinese tourism to Japan, and canceling cultural exchanges and performances. This message was unmistakable. Japan would pay a price for aligning itself more openly with Taiwan. Beyond Taiwan, Beijing has been expanding its disputes with Japan by challenging sovereignty over the Senkaku Islands and increasingly the Ryukyu chain, including Okinawa. Over the past few years, Chinese state media and some academics have pushed claims that the Ryukyu Islands were never legally transferred to Japan or that they form part of the broader Chinese nation. On November 5th, 2025, the Global Times even called for intensified research on the Ryukyu issue, questioning the legitimacy of Japan's historical administration. Beijing bases these arguments on a selective reading of wartime declarations like Cairo and Potsdam, while ignoring the San Francisco Peace Treaty, and crucially, the reality that Taiwan operates as an independent state and Okinawa is a fully integrated part of Japan. China also understands that most residents of Okinawa view Beijing as a threat, not a protector. So instead of trying to win hearts, Beijing focuses on amplifying frustration over US military bases, hoping to turn local grievances into anti-Tokyo sentiment and to weaken support for the Japan-US alliance. On Chinese social media and online forums, narratives circulate claiming that the Ryukyus naturally belong to China or share deep cultural ties with the Chinese nation. These messages aren't aimed at historical accuracy. They're a part of a broader effort to undermine Japan's sovereignty and to challenge the post-World War II international order. In the South China Sea, Beijing has spent more than a decade trying to shift the balance of power step by step. Since 2012, China has expanded its coast guard, increased constant patrols, and deployed large numbers of dual-use fishing vessels, many of which function as maritime militia. After the standoff with the Philippines at Scarborough Shoal, Beijing broke its promise to withdraw and instead moved in permanently. Surveillance stations and the enforcement post followed, turning Scarborough into the first forward outpost of militarized South China Sea. The success of that seizure convinced Chinese strategists that they could replicate the formula elsewhere, wear down the other side, block access, and wait for the exhaustion to force a retreat. From 2013 to 2016, Beijing accelerated its island-building campaign. It transformed reefs such as Fiery Cross, Subi, and Mischief into fortified bases with runways, radar systems, and missile platforms. A chain of military positions extending deep into Southeast Asia. With these artificial islands plus its coast guard and militia fleets, China can operate hundreds of miles from its shore, harassing vessels at Vanguard Bank, Second Thomas Shoal, and around Scarborough Shoal. The aim is always the same: pressure neighboring states into backing down on fishing rights, sovereignty claims, and offshore energy development. Beijing believes this gray zone strategy avoids the kind of lethal confrontation that would draw global condemnation, while still allowing it to gain control through incremental steps. At Second Thomas Shoal, for example, China has tried to prevent the Philippines from resupplying its outposts, hoping Manila would eventually abandon the position. But this approach has begun to meet resistance. Since 2021, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Malaysia have started escorting their energy operations with naval and coast guard vessels, pushing back effectively. The shift in the Philippines has been the most dramatic. After President Marcos took office in 2022, Manila resumed regular patrols. In June 2024, the standoff at Second Thomas Shoal escalated to the most serious confrontation yet. Chinese vessels rammed into a Philippine supply boat, used knives to threaten crew members, and they even cut off a sailor's finger. It came close to triggering the US-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty. China ultimately failed to stop the resupply mission. Instead, the incident pushed Manila closer to Washington, Tokyo, Canberra, Ottawa, and Wellington. That's a coalition now far more willing to counter Beijing's aggression. As a result, China's once effective intimidation strategy is becoming harder to sustain, and the region is no longer yielding as easily as Beijing expected. Beyond its neighbors, Beijing is challenging the foundations of the global system that has been led by the United States for decades. China's strategy stretches from the Yellow Sea to the East and South China Seas, and now outward to ports across Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, and Europe. What began as access to markets has evolved into political leverage over global supply chains. Through port acquisitions, long-term leases, and Belt and Road investments, Beijing is positioning itself to influence or even control key choke points in global trade. If China were ever able to dominate the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea, the US and its allies would find their military logistics and energy routes exposed to Chinese pressure. That is the long-term vision: weaken America's ability to project power, undermine its technological and economic advantages, and erode its moral authority on issues like human rights. This is the broader contest. Not just territorial, but it's more systemic. Beijing is also working to reshape the international institutions meant to uphold global norms. It has pushed its officials into leadership positions at the United Nations and other agencies, influenced the wording of resolutions, and promoted narratives like non-interference in development over human rights. As US engagement in some of these institutions has waned, the CCP has filled the vacuum, embedding its worldview into technical documents of UN language. At the same time, China deepens its coordination with other authoritarian states like Russia, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela. This is how they're forming a loose network of mutual protection on sanctions, human rights investigations, and questions of war responsibility. What emerges is an authoritarian support system designed to shield regimes from accountability and to dilute the influence of liberal democracies. China's ultimate goal is a new world order, one where authority outranks rights, where state power overrides individual freedom, and where economic interests take precedence over the rule of law, with Beijing at the center. And more countries are beginning to realize that this ambition does not end with Taiwan. It's a part of a global project. From the tens of millions killed under communist regimes in the 20th century to today's use of economics, technology, maritime power, and international institutions as instruments of expansion, the nature of the threat has changed, but the ideology behind it has not. The CCP combines authoritarian governance, global market access, and advanced surveillance tools into a single, outward-driven model. It transforms its own society, absorbs its neighbors, and reaches across borders through legal warfare, gray zone coercion, cultural assimilation, economic leverage, and digital repression. From Tibet, East Turkestan, and Hong Kong to Taiwan, Japan, and the South China Sea, the pattern is pretty consistent. Dismantle identity, reshape narratives, and alter the status quo through force or the threat of force. And on the world stage, China works to rewrite international norms in a way that normalizes authoritarian rule. This is the context in which President Trump designated Anti-Communism Week. A recognition that the free world is facing a challenge more complex and potentially more consequential than the Cold War. The CCP will not stop at Taiwan, it will not stop at regional dominance. Its ambition is to reshape the international order around its own authoritarian vision. Whether the future belongs to free societies or to expanded dictatorships depends on how united the democratic world is willing to be in the years ahead. Thank you for watching. If you liked the video, please press like, subscribe, and share. And remember that freedom is not free.